They put a jetliner underwater and made it breathe 3,000 pressure cycles into its life. The metal opened, not at a passenger window, but at the corner of an escape hatch. The Comet had passed its tests. The tests missed the danger. What the investigators did to find that out changed how every pressurized aircraft since has been proven safe. In May 1952, the world's first jet airliner entered scheduled passenger service. The de Havilland Comet flew higher and faster than anything carrying passengers before it, and to do that, it had to hold pressure. At cruising altitude, the cabin was inflated to about 8¼ pounds per square inch above the thin air outside. The engineers designed that cabin for roughly 10,000 flights, about 10 years of service. Every time it climbed, the shell stretched. Every time it descended, the shell relaxed. That is a load cycle, and a metal structure has only so many of them in it. The cabin was not a smooth tube either. It was interrupted by windows, by hatches, and by an opening in the roof for a radio antenna. Each cutout forced the load to travel around it, and the metal at the corners of those openings carried far more stress than the skin between them. Every pressurized flight consumed a little of the cabin's finite fatigue life. A year into service, another Comet had already been lost near Calcutta in a thunderstorm, but that finding pointed to structural overstress in violent weather, not to the cabin. Then, on the 10th of January 1954, an aircraft broke up near the island of Elba. 35 people were killed. The fleet was withdrawn while engineers searched for a cause, and after inspections and modifications, it flew again in March. The cause was still unknown. On the 8th of April, a second aircraft broke up southeast of Naples. 21 people were killed. Within days, the certificates of airworthiness were withdrawn, and the fleet stopped flying. Both aircraft had come down in deep water. Investigators recovered what they could from the seabed off Elba, but wreckage alone was not going to settle it. On the 18th of April, the director of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Sir Arnold Hall, made the decision that shaped everything after it. Rather than wait for the sea to give up more evidence, he ordered something nobody had attempted at this scale: take a complete pressure cabin and load it over and over until it broke. The aircraft they chose was a Comet already in service. Registration Golf Alpha Lima Yankee uniform. Engineers built a tank around its fuselage, filled the cabin with water, and submerged the whole thing. Water was the crucial choice. Air stores energy when you compress it, so a cabin pressurized with air fails violently and destroys the evidence you need. Water barely compresses at all. When the shell finally opened, the rupture released comparatively little energy. The structure survived, and the crack could be examined, repaired, and tested again. The water outside also supported the structure and canceled the weight of the water within, so the shell felt pressure rather than a bathtub. The rig applied one cabin pressure cycle for every simulated flight, along with wing-bending loads, standing in for ordinary gusts. About every 1,000 flights, the pressure was pushed higher to around 11 pounds per square inch as a proving load. It did not reproduce everything the aircraft met in service. Engine and aerodynamic vibration were left out, and so were the fluctuations of takeoff and landing. This particular airframe had already flown 1,230 pressurized flights before it ever entered the tank. The rig added about 1,830 more, and then about 3,060 pressure cycles into its life. The cabin failed. It did not fail at a passenger window. The tear began at a corner of the forward escape hatch, and when they examined the fracture, it carried something remarkable: algal discoloration, growth from the water, staining part of the surface. That meant the crack had already been opened through several earlier pressure applications. It had not appeared suddenly. It had been growing quietly, flight after flight, while the aircraft looked perfectly sound. That finding turned the investigation toward fatigue. When the roof section of the Elba aircraft was recovered from the seabed, it agreed. The pressure cabin had failed first, and the initial fracture sat in the roof, around the rear aperture for the radio compass, most probably at a countersunk fastener hole near one corner, though the court was careful to say it could not prove a single exact starting point. You have probably heard that the Comet failed because its windows were square. That is not what the evidence says. The passenger windows were rectangular with rounded corners, tighter radii than the ovals you see on later jetliners, but not sharp squares. The tank aircraft failed at an escape hatch, not a passenger window, and later full-scale testing, carried out in 1960 on a different airframe, found what the simple story misses. Across 9 passenger windows, 2 escape hatches, and 16 corners, every fatigue crack began at a countersunk rivet hole inside the high-stress corner region. Not one began at the edge of the aperture itself. There was one more thing the inquiry exposed, and it is the part that matters most. An earlier test had cycled a forward cabin section about 18,000 times before it failed, which looked like an enormous margin over a 10,000 flight design life. But that specimen had been through high test pressures beforehand, and that history had probably relieved the very stress peaks the test was supposed to find. It was reassuring, and it was not representative. The company's own design figure, 28,000 pounds per square inch, was an average across a broader area. The establishment's later estimate for the metal at an aperture corner was around 43,000. Those two numbers were never measuring the same thing. The court found the cause to be structural failure of the pressure cabin brought about by fatigue. It found no wrongful act, no default, and no negligence by anyone. This was not a known defect being ignored. It was a failure of assumptions and of a test that was not representative of the thing it was meant to prove. What changed afterwards was not really the shape of a window, it was the standard of proof. A cabin would be tested complete, and it would be tested underwater.